"You're greedy. That money was always meant for your brother." My father set it across a table set for his anniversary, smiling. $68,000. My grandfather had left it to me, in my name, in writing, and my father had quietly moved it into my brother's failing dealership like it was a checkbook he'd misplaced. Then, he called me greedy for asking where it went. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't leave. I just reached into my bag and set one folded sheet of paper on the table. 6 weeks later, he'd be the one explaining himself to a room full of people who used to call him a good man. But that night, he still thought I'd come to beg. What he didn't know was that the quiet one at the end of the table had already read every line of my grandfather's will, twice. So let me back up to how a sheet of paper ended up in my bag. My grandfather was named Aldous. Everyone called him Al. He fixed watches in a shop on Front Street for 40 years, and he was the only person in my family who ever looked at me like I was finished, not in progress. When I was small, he'd let me sit on the high stool and hold the tiny screws while he worked. He'd say, "Greta, you've got steady hands. Steady hands are honest hands." I believed him because no one else in that house said anything like it. My father is Carl. My brother is Soren, 3 years older, and from the day Soren was born, my father decided the family had a future, and it had Soren's name on it. My mother passed when I was 19, and after that, the house got quieter and the favoritism got louder. Soren got the car. Soren got the down payment. Soren got the toast at every dinner. I got told I was lucky to have a roof, even after I'd moved out and paid my own rent for a decade. Grandpa Al saw all of it. He never said much in front of my father, but he watched. 2 years before he died, he pulled me aside at a Sunday lunch and pressed a small slip of paper into my hand. An account number. "When I'm gone," he said, "this is yours, not the family's. Yours." I set it up so nobody has to ask permission. I told him not to talk like that. He squeezed my wrist. "Steady hands, Greta. Don't let them shake you." I tucked the slip into my wallet and tried not to think about a world without him in it. He died last September. A stroke, fast in his sleep. I found out the way I found out everything in that family. Late, secondhand, from Soren, who texted me the funeral details and nothing else. At the service, my father gave a eulogy about what a hard-working man his father had been, how the watch shop had taught them all the value of $1. I sat in the back, the 4th pew. Nobody saved me a seat up front. After the burial, my father pulled me aside and told me Grandpa's affairs were being handled, that I didn't need to worry about any of it, that he had it under control. I almost let it go. That's the part I'm not proud of. I almost let it go. That was the moment I realized the people who told me not to worry were always the ones with something to hide. Before I go any further, if this story is already getting under your skin, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I read them. I'm Greta, I'm 31, and what you just heard was only the first thread of something my father spent months hoping I'd never pull. So let me get back to what happened after the funeral. 3 weeks after we buried Grandpa Al, I got a letter in the mail. Real mail, an envelope, heavy paper. The return address was a law office downtown, Hartwell and Reese. I'd never heard of them. Inside was a single page from a man named David Reese, who introduced himself as the attorney who had handled my grandfather's estate. He wrote that he was reaching out to confirm a beneficiary designation and that he'd been trying to reach me for 2 weeks. He'd left voicemails. I had no voicemails. He'd mailed an earlier letter to my father's house, the address my grandfather had on file. I had never received it. I read that part twice. The first letter went to my father's house. I called the office the next morning on my break. I scrub in for surgeries at a hospital across the river, so I called from the locker room with my hair still under a cap. A woman put me through, and David Reese had this dry, careful voice. The voice of a man who'd watched a lot of families come apart over money. "Ms. Lindqvist," he said, "I'm glad you called. I was beginning to think you didn't want the account." "What account?" I said. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I felt my stomach drop. "The account your grandfather designated to you," he said slowly. $68,000. You're the sole named beneficiary." I sat down on the bench. "I don't have any account," I said. "Nobody's told me about any account." Another pause. "Ms. Lindqvist," he said, and his voice changed. "I think we need to meet." I didn't tell anyone where I was going. David Reese's office was small and smelled like old paper and coffee. He was maybe 60, gray at the temples with reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose. He had a folder on the desk between us, and he didn't open it right away. He just looked at me. "How much do you know about your grandfather's arrangements?" he asked. I told him the truth, that Grandpa had given me an account number 2 years ago. That he'd said it was mine, that he'd set it up so no one had to ask permission. That my father had told me everything was handled. Reese nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd been afraid of. Then he opened the folder. "Your grandfather was a careful man," he said. "He came to me 3 years ago. He set up a transfer on death account, $68,000, the savings from selling his shop. One beneficiary, you." He slid a photocopy across the desk. My name, my grandfather's signature, a date. "On death, that account passes directly to you. It doesn't go through the estate. It doesn't go through probate. It doesn't go to your father." "Okay," I said, "so where is it?" He took off his glasses. 2 weeks ago," he said, "I tried to initiate the transfer to your name, as instructed. The account had been emptied. 41 days before that. The funds were withdrawn by the joint signatory." "The joint signatory," I repeated. "Your grandfather added a second name to the account about a year ago," Reese said. "For convenience," he told me, so someone could pay his bills if he got sick. He swore the beneficiary designation stood no matter what. He looked at me. "The second name on the account is Carl Lindqvist, your father." I want to tell you, I was surprised. The terrible thing is, I wasn't, not really. "He took it," I said. 41 days before death isn't the issue," Reese said carefully. "He had access. What he did with it after your grandfather died, that's the issue. The beneficiary designation made that money yours the moment your grandfather passed. He withdrew it 3 days after the funeral. 3 days, while I was still wearing black, while he was telling me not to worry." "Where did it go?" I asked. Reese folded his hands. "That," he said, "I was hoping you could help me find out." I left that office with a photocopy of my grandfather's signature in my bag, and a feeling I'd never had before in my life. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, like a door clicking shut behind me. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and didn't start it. I pulled out the photocopy and read it again. My name. My grandfather's signature, the one I'd watched form 1,000 times over watch parts. The date, 3 years ago. He'd planned this 3 years ago. He'd sat in that office and thought ahead to a day he wouldn't be alive to protect me, and he'd made sure I'd be protected anyway. I thought about the last time I saw him. A Sunday, 2 weeks before the stroke. He'd been tired but sharp, and he'd held my hand at the door longer than usual. He'd said, "You take care of yourself, Greta. Don't wait on anyone to do it for you." I'd thought it was just an old man saying goodbye. Now I understood it was instructions. I called Reese back before I even left the lot. "If the money's gone," I said, "what do I actually do?" "First, you don't tip him off," Reese said. "If your father knows a lawyer's involved, he'll move things, lawyer up, start building a story. People who take money always build a story. Let him think it worked. Meanwhile, you gather. Quietly." "Gather what?" "Anything that puts the money somewhere after it left. Anything that shows he benefited or that someone close to him did. Dates, records, witnesses. You're not proving a crime. You're building a picture so complete that when you finally hold up the document, there's nowhere left for him to stand." He paused. "Can you do quiet?" I almost laughed. "I've been quiet my whole life," I said. "It's the loud part I've never tried." Here's something you should understand about who I was before that letter came. I was the family's quiet one, the one who didn't make waves. My whole life, I'd been told my version of events was wrong, dramatic, ungrateful. My father had a way of looking at me when I spoke that made me doubt my own memory. I'd learned to swallow things, to not ask, to tell myself I was imagining the way they treated me. I'd been the one in my family whose word was worth nothing, the one they could lie to because they knew I'd talk myself out of believing the truth. Not anymore, because what I did next, the old me would never have done. I started keeping receipts. The first thing I did was nothing. That sounds strange, but it's the truth. I went home and I sat with it. Because the moment I confronted my father with no proof, he would do what he always did. He would make it about my tone, about how dramatic I was being, about how I was attacking the family over Grandpa's grave. He would win, the way he always won, by turning the question of what he did into a question of who I was. And I would walk away, doubting myself. Not this time. So I started gathering. Reese sent me certified copies of everything. The account agreement, the beneficiary form, my grandfather's signature, the withdrawal record showing the date and amount. $68,000, gone 3 days after the funeral, transferred by wire. The wire had a destination, but the receiving account was just a number. I needed to know whose number. I knew whose, I just couldn't prove it yet. My brother Soren ran a used car dealership on the south side called Lindqvist Auto. He'd opened it 4 years earlier with money from my father, and it had been quietly drowning ever since. I knew this the way you know things, in a family that doesn't tell you anything directly, through overheard phone calls, through the way my father's jaw tightened when the lot came up, through Soren's increasingly aggressive Facebook posts about blowout inventory events. 2 months before Grandpa died, I'd been at the house dropping off a prescription for my father's blood pressure. I heard him on the phone in the kitchen. His voice low. "The bank's not going to wait, Soren. You've got to come up with something." I'd stood in the hallway, holding a paper bag from the pharmacy, and pretended I hadn't heard. I hadn't thought about it again until Reese told me the account was empty. Now I thought about it constantly. I needed to connect the wire to the dealership. A destination account number isn't enough on its own. Banks don't just tell you who owns a number. So I went at it the way I scrub in for a hard case, slow, methodical, one layer at a time. I started with what was public. The dealership was an LLC. I pulled the state business filings online. Lindqvist Auto LLC, registered to Soren with my father listed as a member. There was a registered address and an annual report. Then I checked the county records for liens. There were 3. 2 from a floor plan lender, the company that finances a dealer's inventory, and 1 from a bank, filed last August, a month before Grandpa died. The lien was for default. Soren was behind on the loans that kept cars on his lot. And then, in October, 3 weeks after the funeral, 2 of those liens were released, paid off. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the dates until they blurred. The money disappears from Grandpa's account 3 days after the funeral. 3 weeks later, Soren's overdue loans get paid. I'm not a forensic accountant, but I can read a calendar. It wasn't proof. A lawyer would tell me it was circumstantial. So I kept going. I printed the lien records and laid them next to Reese's documents on my kitchen floor. I'm used to organizing things under pressure. In surgery, everything has its place, every instrument laid out in order before the first cut. I treated this the same way. A tray of facts, arranged so I could see the whole picture at a glance. Document 1, the beneficiary form. My name, 3 years old, never revoked. Document 2, the withdrawal record, $68,000, wired out 3 days after the funeral. Document 3, The dealership liens, filed in August, the month before Grandpa died. Document 4. 2 of those liens released in October, paid in full. Between Document 2 and Document 4, 23 days, 3 weeks. The exact gap a wire takes to clear, get parked, and get dispersed by a man who thinks no one's looking. I sat back on my heels and looked at the tray of facts on my kitchen tile. For the first time, I could see the shape of it whole. Not a feeling, not a suspicion I'd talk myself out of by morning. A shape, in paper, on the floor. But a shape isn't a case. I needed the dealership's side, and the only way to get inside a closed company's books was either a subpoena, which meant filing first, which meant tipping my father off, or a witness who was already inside. I thought about who was inside, and I thought about my grandmother. I went to see my grandmother. My grandmother, my grandfather's wife, Ingrid, was 81 and lived in a senior apartment my father had moved her into the year before, after Grandpa got sick. She and I had always been close, but I hadn't seen her much since the funeral. My father controlled who visited and when. He told me she got confused with too many guests. She was not confused. She was furious. I brought her coffee and a coffee cake, and we sat by her window, and for 20 minutes we talked about Grandpa, about the watch shop, about the way he used to whistle when he worked. And then she set down her cup and looked at me with eyes exactly like my grandfather's. "Has your father given you your money?" she asked. I went very still. "What money, Grandma?" "Don't play dumb with me, child. Al's money, the account. He told me about it the week before he passed. Sat right where you're sitting. Said, 'Ingrid, I've made sure Greta gets something that's hers alone. Carl can't touch it.'" She shook her head. "Then your father came to see me in October. Asked me a lot of questions about whether Al had mentioned any accounts to me. I told him to mind his own business." She narrowed her eyes. "He hasn't given it to you, has he?" I told her. All of it. The empty account, the wire, the liens on the dealership, the dates lining up. My grandmother listened, and her hands shook a little around her cup. And when I finished, she said something I will never forget. "He did the same thing to me," she said quietly. "When Al got sick, Carl took over the bills, the bank account. He said it was easier. After Al passed, I asked for the statements, and Carl told me not to worry about money at my age." She looked at me. "I'm 81, Greta. I'm not dead. I know how much was in our savings, and I know how much is there now, because the bank still sends me a paper statement to this address. Your father doesn't know that." My heart was pounding. "Grandma, do you still have those statements?" She got up, went to a drawer, and came back with a stack of envelopes held together with a rubber band. "I keep everything," she said. Al taught me that. Steady hands, honest records. I almost laughed. I almost cried. We sat at her little table and went through them together, one envelope at a time. She had a magnifying glass she kept by the lamp, and she ran it down the columns of numbers like she was reading scripture. Her finger stopped on a line in October. "There," she said, 11,000. I never moved that. I never authorized that. I called the bank, and they said an authorized signer made the transfer. Carl. He put himself on the account when Al got sick. To help, he said." She looked up at me over the glasses. "He helped himself. Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "Because who would I tell?" she said. "He controls who visits me. He told the family I was getting forgetful. If I'd called the family and said Carl stole from me, what do you think they'd have believed? A confused old woman, or the responsible son taking care of his sick mother-in-law?" She folded her hands. "He built a story about me, Greta. Same as he's going to build one about you. That's how he does it. He decides who you are before you get a chance to be anything else." I reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was paper thin, and her knuckles were swollen, and her grip, when she squeezed back, was stronger than I expected. "Then we'll bring the paper," I said. "He can't tell a story over the paper." She smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "That's what Al would say." What my father didn't know was that the woman he'd written off as a confused old lady had been quietly saving every piece of paper he thought he'd controlled. I went home that night and laid the statements out across my kitchen floor. My grandmother's savings account, the joint one my grandfather had shared with her, showed a withdrawal too. Smaller, $11,000, made the same week as the wire from my account. Same pattern. My father had access as the bill payer, and he'd swept what he could from two old people who trusted him. But the statements alone didn't prove where the money went. They proved it left. I needed the other end. I needed to put the money inside the dealership. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I did something that, 2 months earlier, I would have called insane. I drove to the dealership. Lindqvist Auto was a sad little lot with strings of plastic flags snapping in the wind and a trailer for an office. I parked across the street and watched for a while. Soren's truck was there. So was my father's sedan. They were both at the lot on a Tuesday afternoon, which told me something. My father, who claimed to be retired, who'd told me at the funeral that he didn't have the energy for money matters anymore, was spending his days at his son's failing dealership. I watched my father walk a customer across the lot. Even from across the street, I could read his body, the open hands, the easy smile, the way he tilted his head to listen like the other person was the most important man alive. I knew that performance. I'd grown up inside it. It was the same face he wore when he told me not to worry, that everything was handled. A woman came out of the trailer and stuck a sail balloon onto a windshield. I recognized her. A bookkeeper Soren had hired part-time, a friend of his wife's. She handled the paperwork. Which meant she handled the books. Which meant she'd have seen money come in. I filed that away. A bookkeeper is a witness who doesn't know they're a witness yet. I didn't go in. Not yet. I'm a scrub nurse, not a detective. I knew if Soren saw me asking questions, he'd call my father, and my father would lock everything down before I had anything solid. So I went home and did the boring thing. The legal thing. I called David Reese. I can connect the dates, I told him. I can show the money left 2 accounts the same week. I can show the dealership's liens got paid off 3 weeks later, but I can't prove the dollar went from point A to point B. You don't have to, Reese said. You're not a prosecutor. You don't need to trace the bill. You have a beneficiary designation that made that account legally yours. The moment your grandfather died, $68,000 belonged to you. Your father withdrew it after death. That's conversion. That's a civil claim, possibly a criminal one. The bank has the wire record. A court can subpoena where it landed. You don't need to prove it. You need to make him prove he had any right to move it. I gripped the phone. He'll say Grandpa gave it to him, verbally. That Grandpa changed his mind. Then he'll need to explain why your grandfather kept a signed, dated, written beneficiary designation naming you, executed 3 years ago and never revoked. Reese said. Verbal claims don't beat a notarized document. Greta, your grandfather built this so you wouldn't have to fight. He made the paperwork bulletproof. All you have to do is show up holding it. I closed my eyes, steady hands, but I wanted one more thing before the dinner. I wanted something from inside the dealership, something that would make it impossible for my father to claim Grandpa's money, never touch the lot. And I remembered the bookkeeper. I went back to Lindqvist Auto on a Saturday, when I knew my father played golf and Soren took his kids to their games. The lot was nearly empty. The bookkeeper, her name was Renata, was alone in the trailer, and she remembered me from family barbecues years ago. I told her the truth mostly, that I was sorting out my grandfather's estate, that there'd been some money come into the business around October, and that I needed to understand it for the lawyer handling things. She didn't know anything was wrong. That was the point. To her, I was just Soren's sister doing paperwork. She frowned at her screen. October, she said. Yeah, there was a big capital infusion that month. Owner contribution, that's how Soren told me to book it. Came in by wire. Paid down the floor plan loans the same week. She squinted. Funny, actually. The memo line on the wire was weird. My pulse went up. Weird how? She turned the monitor toward me. There, in the memo field of a $60,000 wire, in my father's habit of labeling everything, were 3 words. Al's estate, gift. Al's estate, my grandfather's name, in the memo line, on money that had left my account and landed in my brother's business. My father had labeled the theft himself, the way he labeled everything, because it never once occurred to him that anyone would look. Can I get a printout of that? I asked, as casually as I could manage. Sure, Renata said. It's your grandpa's estate, right? Makes sense you'd want it. She hit print and handed me the page, and she had no idea she'd just handed me the bridge. The one piece that connected the money leaving my account to the money landing on that lot, in my father's own words. I thanked her. I walked back to my car. I sat down, and I let myself breathe for the first time in weeks, because I finally had it. Not a feeling, not a calendar, a line of text in my father's hand, putting Grandpa's name on stolen money. I called Reese from the lot. I've got the other end, I told him. The wire memo says Al's estate, gift, his own bookkeeping. There was a pause. Greta, Reese said, and for the first time, the dry lawyer's voice had something warm in it. That's not circumstantial anymore. That's an admission. Don't lose that page. I won't, I said. I keep everything now. There's one more thing, Reese said. Before you do anything, get a single, clean bank statement. One page that shows the account, your grandfather's name, the balance, and the withdrawal date. Not the whole file. One page. When you put one clean page in front of someone who's lying, they panic. They start explaining a stack. One page they can't argue with. One page. I knew exactly when I'd use it. That weekend, my father called me. He never called. The screen lighting up with his name made my stomach tighten, the way it had my whole life. Greta, he said, warm as ever. I haven't heard from you. I wanted to check in. You doing all right since the funeral? I made myself sound tired, small, the daughter he expected. I'm okay, Dad. Just working a lot. Good, good. Work's good for grief. A pause. Listen, did anyone from your grandfather's, did any lawyers reach out to you about the estate? There were some loose ends I wanted to make sure nobody bothered you with. There it was. He was fishing. He wanted to know if Reese had found me. No, I said. Should someone have? The relief in his voice was almost audible. No, just paperwork. I'm handling all of it, like I said. You don't worry about a thing. Then, lighter. You're coming to the anniversary dinner, right? Be nice to have the whole family together. After everything. I'll be there, I said. That's my girl. And he hung up. I set the phone down, and my hand was shaking. Not from fear, from the effort of sounding like the person he thought he was talking to. He thought he'd checked the lock. He thought he'd confirmed the coast was clear. He'd just told me, in his own words, that he was watching for exactly the thing I already had in my bag. I wrote down the date and time of the call, steady hands, honest records. I should pause here, because if you've been counting, you know what's coming. My father's 40th wedding anniversary, his second wife, my stepmother, was in 6 weeks. A dinner, the whole family. And he'd already, weeks earlier, told me I was expected to come and be normal about everything. What do you think he'd already told the rest of the family about Grandpa's money? Take a guess before I tell you, because I found out, and it was worse than I expected. A week before the dinner, my aunt called me. My Aunt Margaret is my father's sister, and she'd always been kind to me, in the distant way of someone who didn't want trouble. She called to ask if I was bringing anything to the anniversary dinner, and then, almost as an afterthought, she said something that made my hand tighten on the phone. I think it's lovely what you did, she said. Letting Soren have Grandpa's little nest egg, Carl told us. He said you wanted Soren to have it for the business. Very generous of you, sweetheart, especially with everything you've got going on. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I felt the room tilt. Carl told you I gave it to Soren, I said. Well, yes. He said you all talked about it after the funeral, and you agreed it should go to the dealership. He's been telling everyone how mature you were about it. A pause. Greta, you there? I was there. I was very much there. My father hadn't just stolen the money. He'd built a story around the theft and handed it to the whole family, casting me as the generous sister who'd given up her inheritance with a smile. He'd turned his crime into my gift, so that if I ever spoke up, I wouldn't be the woman who'd been robbed. I'd be the woman who'd changed her mind, who was suddenly being greedy, who was tearing the family apart over money she'd already agreed to give away. He was that good. He'd been that good my whole life. Aunt Margaret, I said, and my voice was very calm. Did Soren or my father ever show you anything? Any paper? Anything I signed? A pause. No, why would they? It was a family thing. Right, I said. A family thing. I hung up and I sat down on my kitchen floor, surrounded by the statements I'd laid out 3 weeks earlier. And for the first time since the funeral, I let it crack. Just for a minute. I thought about my grandfather pressing that slip of paper into my hand. Not the family's. Yours. I thought about how hard he'd worked to make sure no one could take it. How he'd gone to a lawyer, signed forms, built a fortress of paper around one act of love for the one grandchild nobody else valued. And my father had walked through all of it in 3 days, and then told everyone I'd opened the door myself. I didn't cry for the money. I cried because I finally understood that they were never going to believe me. Not because the truth was unclear, because believing me would cost them too much. I sat on that floor a long time, long enough that the light changed. I thought about every dinner where I'd been told I was dramatic. Every time my memory of an event had been corrected, gently, until I doubted it. Every time my word had lost to my father's, because his came with that warm, certain smile, and mine came with a shake in it. He hadn't just taken my grandfather's money. He'd spent my whole childhood taking my own certainty about what was true. The money was just the first thing solid enough to hold up to the light. And then I stopped crying, because I realized something else. They didn't have to believe me. They had to read. I called David Reese one more time. I told him about my aunt, about the story my father had spread, about the dinner coming up. Don't ambush him alone in private, Reese said. If you confront him one-on-one, it's your word against his again, and he'll spin it. You need witnesses. You need the same audience he lied to. A pause. But, Greta, be sure, once you put that paper on the table in front of everyone, there's no taking it back. This will not heal your family. It will end something. It already ended, I said. He just didn't tell anyone. The week before the dinner, I made copies. The beneficiary designation, the account agreement, the withdrawal record, my grandmother's statements, the lien releases. I made a clean folder and I made one clean page. Exactly the way Reese told me. One sheet, my grandfather's name, the account, the balance, the withdrawal date stamped across the bottom. I folded it twice and put it in the inner pocket of my bag. Then I asked my grandmother if she would come to the dinner. She hadn't been invited. My father had been keeping her away from family events, telling everyone she got tired. But she was his mother-in-law's generation, his late wife's mother, and there was no version of a 40th anniversary dinner where her presence could be called inappropriate. I rented a car with a comfortable seat. I told her to bring her statements. "Are you sure, child?" she asked me. "Carl will never forgive you." "Grandma," I said, "he stole from you too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she went and got her good coat. The dinner was at my father's house, the house I grew up in. In the dining room with the long table where I'd been told 100 times that I was lucky and dramatic and wrong. There were 14 people there. I counted the way Reese told me to count, so I'd remember it clearly later. My father, my stepmother, Soren and his wife, my Aunt Margaret and her husband. 2 cousins, a neighbor couple my father liked to impress, my grandmother, who who I walked in beside, holding her arm, and me. When my father saw my grandmother, something flickered across his face. Just for a second. Then he smiled his good smile and came over and kissed her cheek and said, "Mother, what a surprise. We didn't think you were up to it." "I'm up to a great deal, Carl," she said. "More than you know." I got her settled. I helped serve. I was, as instructed, normal. I waited. I waited through the toast, where my father stood at the head of the table and talked about family and legacy, and how the most important thing a man could leave behind was his good name. I waited through dinner. I let him have the whole evening because I needed him relaxed. I needed him to think he'd won, the way he always thought he'd won, right up until the moment he hadn't. It was over dessert that he did it himself. My Aunt Margaret, sweet and oblivious, raised her glass toward me and said, "And to Greta, for being so generous to her brother, family taking care of family." The table murmured warmly. Soren looked at his plate. My father beamed. "That's right," he said. "My daughter did a beautiful thing. She knew her brother was going through a rough patch with the lot, and she let Grandpa's money go where it could do some good." He looked at me, and his eyes had that old shine, the one that used to make me doubt myself. "Didn't you, Greta? You gave it up gladly." The whole table looked at me. This was the moment. He'd handed it to me, the way I knew he would, because he could not help himself. He could not just steal. He had to make me confirm the lie out loud, in front of everyone, so that it became real. I set down my fork. "No," I said, "I didn't." The murmur stopped. My father's smile stayed exactly where it was, but his eyes went flat. "Greta," he said warmly, a warning underneath it. "We talked about this, after the funeral. You agreed." "We never talked about it," I said. My voice was very even. "You told me everything was handled. You never asked me anything. There was nothing to agree to." A nervous laugh from the neighbor's wife. My aunt looked confused. Soren had gone still. "Sweetheart," my father said, and now there was an edge sharpening under the warmth. "This isn't the place. Don't do this. Don't make this about money over your mother's anniversary." "It's your anniversary," I said. "Mom's been gone 12 years. The table got very quiet. My father's jaw tightened. "You're being greedy," he said, and the warmth was gone now. He said it flatly, like a fact everyone already knew. "That money was always meant for your brother. You're going to sit at this table and embarrass this family over $68,000 that your grandfather wanted to keep in the business." There it was, the first lie, out loud in front of 14 people. Your grandfather wanted to keep it in the business. I reached into my bag. "Grandpa Al," I said, "set up an account 3 years ago. Transfer on death, one name on it, point to the line where it says it was ever yours to move." I unfolded the single page and slid it across the table. It traveled the length of the white tablecloth and stopped in front of my father. One sheet, my grandfather's name, the account, the balance, the withdrawal date. My father didn't look at it. "I don't know what that is," he said. "It's the account," I said. "The one Grandpa set up so nobody had to ask permission. My name is on the beneficiary form. Yours is on the withdrawal. 3 days after the funeral." He picked up the page then, finally, and glanced at it, and set it down with the dismissive flick of a man brushing away a fly. "This is nothing," he said. "This is a bank printout. You can print anything off a computer these days." "That's true," I said. "So let's not rely on it. Let's rely on what Grandpa signed." I took a second page from my folder and set it next to the first. "Beneficiary designation. Notarized 3 years ago. His signature. Witnessed. You knew about it. You're the one who added your own name to the account a year later. For convenience, you said. The convenience was that it gave you the password to a door that was never yours." "That's a private family matter," he said, louder now. "You went behind my back to a lawyer? Over money?" "The lawyer came to me," I said, "because he couldn't transfer my inheritance, because the account was empty." My Aunt Margaret's voice came small from the middle of the table. "Carl, what is she talking about? You said she gave it to Soren." And there, That was the crack, because my father, cornered, did what cornered men do. He doubled down. She did, he snapped. She's lying. She agreed, and now she's changed her mind because she's bitter. She's always been bitter. Ask anyone at this table what she's like. Show them the agreement, I said quietly. What? If I gave it to Soren, there's paperwork. A gift that size, you'd document it, show them where I signed. He stared at me. There's nothing to show, I said, because I never signed anything. You took it and you told everyone I gave it. You built me a halo so that the day I asked for my own money back, I'd be the villain. I looked around the table. He's been telling you a story about how generous I was. I'm not generous. I'm robbed. There's a difference, and it's on that page in front of him. You can't prove a word of this, my father said. A bank printout, a lawyer you ran to behind my back. I took out the third page. This is the wire, I said. $60,000 into Soren's dealership, October. Paid off the loans the bank was about to foreclose on. I slid it across. Read the memo line. He didn't move, so I read it for the table. It says, in your handwriting, in the bookkeeping you did yourself. Al's estate, gift. I let it sit. You put Grandpa's name on it. You labeled it yourself, because it never crossed your mind that anyone would ever look. The neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Don, the kind of man my father loved to impress, reached over and turned the paper around to read it. He put on his glasses. He read slowly, the way careful people read. The table watched him read. Carl, Don said quietly, looking up. This says the beneficiary is Greta. And it says the withdrawal was made by Carl Lindqvist, 3 days after the funeral. He set it down gently. Son, that's not a story about generosity. That's a different kind of story. My father's hand slammed flat on top of the page. You don't get to sit at my table and read my family's private business out loud, he said. You read it out loud first, Don said. An hour ago, with a toast. The table went very quiet. My stepmother had both hands pressed to her mouth. My Aunt Margaret was staring at her brother like she'd never seen him before. That's when my grandmother spoke. He took mine too, she said. Every head turned. 81 years old, in her good coat, her hands folded on the table, calm as a Sunday. When Al got sick, Carl took over our bills, she said. After Al passed, he told me not to worry about money at my age. I worried anyway. The bank still mails me paper statements. She reached into her purse and took out her own folded pages and set them down, unhurried. $11,000 left our savings the same week. $68,000 left Greta's. I'm old, Carl. I'm not stupid. And I'm not confused, no matter what you've told these people about me. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. Mother, my father said, and his voice had changed completely now, gone tight and high. You don't understand the family finances. I understand my own savings account, she said. I've understood it for 60 years. She slid her statements down the table the way I'd slid mine. They stopped in front of my stepmother, who picked them up with trembling fingers. Carl, my stepmother whispered, is this your mother's money? He didn't answer. The silence stretched, and the not answering was its own answer. And everyone at the table heard it. The neighbor's wife had stopped pretending to eat. My 2 cousins, who'd come for a free dinner and a quiet evening, were staring at their plates. My Aunt Margaret's husband, a man who'd never said 10 words to me in my life, leaned over and read my grandmother's statement and then sat back slowly, like the chair had gotten heavier. My father stood up. This is the part Reese warned me about. The part where the antagonist, with everyone watching, stops trying to win and starts trying to survive, and in surviving, tells the truth he's been hiding all along. Fine, my father said. His chair scraped back. He was breathing hard. Fine. You want to do this here? At my anniversary? In front of everyone? He pointed at Soren. Your brother was going to lose the dealership. The bank was going to take it. 4 years of his life, gone on the street, and you—" He turned to me, and his face was red now, the good mask completely gone. "You had $68,000 sitting in an account, doing nothing." "Nothing? What were you going to do with it? You don't have kids, you don't have a business, you scrub floors at a hospital." "I scrub in for surgery," I said, steady hands. "You didn't need it," he shouted. "Your brother needed it. That's what family does. I made a decision for this family, and I'd make it again." The room had gone completely still. Because there it was. He'd just told 14 people that yes, he took it on purpose by choice, because he decided my inheritance belonged to his son. He'd confessed in front of all of them, trying to make it sound noble, and instead it sounded exactly like what it was. My Aunt Margaret set down her glass. "Carl," she said, "you told us she gave it to him." "I told you what kept this family together," he said. "You lied to us," she said slowly. "To all of us. You sat in my living room and told me Greta was generous and mature, and the whole time—" "She got over it," he shouted. "She would have gotten over it." Soren stood up. My brother, who had been silent the whole time, staring at his plate. He looked gray. "Dad," he said, "stop talking." "Soren." "You told me it was a loan from Grandpa's estate," Soren said, and his voice cracked. "You told me Grandpa wanted to help me. You said it was settled." He looked at me, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen since we were kids. "You said she knew. You said she was fine with it." "You said it was Grandpa's wish," Soren said again, louder, and his voice broke on it. "I took that money, thinking my grandfather wanted me to have it. I told my kids their great-grandfather believed in me. You let me tell them that." He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. "It was hers. It was Greta's. And you sat me down and looked me in the face and called it a blessing." The whole table understood, all at once, what had happened. My father hadn't just lied to me and to the family. He'd lied to Soren, too. He'd handed my brother stolen money and called it a gift, so that Soren would owe him, so that the family would owe him, so that he'd be the man who held everyone together with money that was never his to give. He'd even poisoned my brother's gratitude, let him be thankful to a dead man for a theft. My father looked around the table at 14 faces, and for the first time in my life, I watched him understand that the room was not on his side. He looked at my stepmother first. She wouldn't meet his eyes. He looked at his sister, Margaret, who defended him for 40 years, and she folded her napkin and set it on the table with the careful precision of a woman done. He looked at Dawn, the neighbor he'd wanted to impress, who simply looked back at him with a kind of sad disappointment that was worse than anger. And then he looked at me, and I watched him reach for the old weapon, the one that had always worked. He drew himself up. "You've always wanted to ruin this family," he said, "since you were a girl, always making trouble, always playing the victim." "Name one time," I said. He stopped. "Name one time I made trouble," I said. "I paid my own rent for 10 years, so you'd never have to. I drove Grandma to her appointments when you said you were busy. I sat in the 4th pew at my own grandfather's funeral and didn't say a word. Name one time I made trouble before tonight." He couldn't. The whole table waited, and he couldn't, because there wasn't one, and everyone there knew it. "This is my house," he said finally. It came out weak. "This is my house, and I won't be." "Sit down, Carl," my grandmother said. He didn't sit down, but he didn't say anything else either. The fight had gone out of him, and what was left was just a man standing at the head of his own table, while the people he'd lied to looked at him and saw, all at once, what he was. I stood up. I gathered my one page from under his hand. He didn't stop me, and I put it back in my folder, and I took out a different page, a copy, and I left that one on the table. "That's a copy," I said. "Keep it. My lawyer's name is on the bottom, David Reese. He'd like to hear from yours." I looked at my brother. "Soren, the liens on the lot are public record. You can see the dates yourself. I'm not coming after you. You didn't know, but you know now. I helped my grandmother up from her chair. She took my arm. At the door, I turned around one more time. My father was still standing at the head of the table. His good name, the thing he'd toasted an hour ago, the most important thing a man could leave behind, was lying on the white tablecloth in front of all his guests, and he had put it there himself. You called me greedy, I said, for asking where my grandfather's money went. I hope it was worth it. Then I walked my grandmother out to the car, and I drove her home, and I did not look back at that house once. If you've ever had to be the one who finally said the thing the whole family agreed not to say, the one who chose the truth over the piece that was really just everyone protecting the person who hurt you, then this part is for you. It cost something, but so did the silence. Here's what actually happened after, because real life isn't a single clean explosion. It's the slow settling afterward. David Reese filed a demand letter the following week. I sat in his office while he drafted it, and I watched him choose every word, like a man laying out instruments. We don't threaten, he said. We describe. Threats sound emotional. A clean description of the facts sounds inevitable. People settle against inevitable. My father hired a lawyer of his own, a man from a strip mall office who, for about a month, made the only argument my father had left. That Grandpa had verbally changed his wishes, that the money was always meant for Soren, that families do this all the time. Reese answered it the way he answered everything, with paper. He sent over the notarized beneficiary designation, executed 3 years before death, and never revoked. He sent the bank's wire record showing my father moved the money 3 days after the funeral. He sent my grandmother's statements. The verbal change argument evaporated. You cannot beat a signed, dated document with a story. One afternoon, Reese called me. His lawyer wants to know if you'd accept the money back and walk away, he said. No suit, no police, just the money. What do you think? I asked. I think a conversion claim and a criminal referral are both on the table, and his lawyer knows it, Reese said. I think your father is realizing that verbal wishes don't beat a notary, and that a wire transfer made 3 days after a funeral looks very bad to a jury. I think he wants this to disappear. A pause. It's your call. Some people want the courtroom. Some people just want what's theirs. I thought about it for a day. I thought about what my grandfather would have wanted. Not a war, but the truth on the record and the money where it belonged. I want it back, I said. All of it. Hers too. And I want the demand and the return documented, so he can never tell anyone again that I gave it away. I'm done being a story he tells. It took 2 more months and most of my patience, but it came back. Every dollar. Into an account with only my name on it. My grandmother got her $11,000 back the same week. I didn't celebrate. I sat with the deposit confirmation on my kitchen table for a long time and thought about my grandfather at his workbench holding the tiny screws, telling me steady hands are honest hands. My grandmother got something else too. She moved out of the apartment my father had put her in, the one where he decided who visited and when, and into a place 6 minutes from me. The day she moved, I carried her boxes up myself. She unpacked her bank statements first, before the dishes, before the photos, and put them in a drawer she could reach. Honest records, she said, and patted the drawer shut. She has her own checkbook again. She mails me letters even though I live around the corner. She says it's so I learn to keep records. I keep everyone. Soren lost the dealership. The money my father funneled in only delayed the inevitable. The business had been failing on its own merits for years, and a stolen $68,000 couldn't fix a hole that big. But something changed between my brother and me. He called me a few weeks after the dinner. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, there was a long silence first, the kind our family is good at. I sold the rest of the inventory, he finally said. I'm getting a job, an actual job, working for somebody else. Another silence. I keep thinking about Grandpa's watch shop, how he never owed anybody anything, how he'd be ashamed of how I ran that place. He wouldn't be ashamed of you for failing, I said. He'd be ashamed of how it got propped up. Yeah? His voice was rough. I didn't know it was yours, Greta. I want you to know I didn't know. Dad told me Grandpa wanted to help me. He said it was settled. He said you knew. He said you were fine with it. I know, I said. He lied to me too, Soren said, and it came out quiet, almost surprised, like a man discovering it as he said it. It wasn't an apology exactly. He's still Soren, and apologies don't come easy in our family. My father made sure of that. But it was the first true thing my brother had said to me in years, and I took it, and I told him so. We're not close. We may never be. But we talk now. Sometimes, and when we do, neither of us is performing. That's new. That's worth something. My father and I don't speak. I sent the message myself, through Reese, in writing, because I wanted it on the record the way I want everything on the record now. No contact, not out of revenge. I've got nothing left to take from him, and he's got nothing I want, out of arithmetic. I added up 40 years of being made to doubt my own eyes, and I decided I was done paying that tax. He's told whoever will still listen that I tore the family apart over money. And a few people believe him, because believing him is easier than believing what he did. My Aunt Margaret isn't one of them anymore. She called me a week after the dinner and said, I sat in my living room and let him make you the villain, and I never once asked to see anything. I'm sorry, Greta. That mattered more than I expected. The ones whose opinions I actually wanted. My grandmother, Margaret, eventually my brother. They saw it for themselves. They read the page. Nobody had to take my word for anything, which, for the first time in my life, was exactly the point. People ask me sometimes if I regret doing it at the dinner, in front of everyone, instead of quietly in a lawyer's office. I don't, because the wound was never really the money. The money came back. The wound was a lifetime of being the one whose word was worth nothing, the one they could lie about, because they knew I'd talk myself out of believing the truth. My grandfather was the only person who ever told me my hands were steady and honest. He built me a fortress out of paper because he knew, even from the grave, that I'd need proof to be believed in my own family. He was right. And the day I finally laid that proof on the table, I wasn't asking them to believe me anymore. I'd stopped needing that. I was just telling the truth. Out loud, where it couldn't be rewritten. And watching the truth do what I could never do alone. I didn't do anything dramatic with the money. I paid off the last of my nursing school loans, the ones I'd carried for years while my father told the family I'd never amounted to much. I put most of the rest away, untouched, the way Grandpa would have. But I did one thing for him. There's a vocational program at a community college near the old shop where people learn small, precise trades. Watch repair, instrument work, the kind of patient handwork my grandfather did for 40 years. I set up a small scholarship in his name, 1 student a year. The application asks for steady hands and honest work. I read every one of them myself. I kept the slip of paper my grandfather pressed into my hand. The account number, in his careful handwriting. The account's closed now. The money's where it belongs. But I keep the slip in my wallet, behind my hospital ID. Sometimes, before a long surgery, I touch it through the leather. Steady hands. Last week, my grandmother and I planted a row of something in pots on my balcony. Nothing fancy, just green things that grow. She told me my grandfather always said the same thing about plants that he said about people. You can't make them honest, but you can give the honest ones room to grow, and you can stop watering the ones that only ever choke you out. I'm done watering what choked me. My hands are steady. They always were. I just needed to stop letting anyone tell me they shook.